Today I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Tracie Revis. Tracie is a citizen of the Muscogee Nation and Yuchi and a leading voice for Indigenous sovereignty, cultural preservation, and environmental stewardship. She serves as Director of Advocacy for the Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve Initiative, working with tribal nations, government partners, and local communities to protect sacred Muscogee homelands and expand access along the Ocmulgee River corridor. Tracie previously served as the first Muscogee woman Chief of Staff for the Muscogee Nation. She holds a BA and an MA in Human Relations from the University of Oklahoma and a JD with a Tribal Law Certificate from the University of Kansas. She is a trusted advisor and speaker who mentors emerging Native leaders with a vision centered on connection among people, land, and generations.
Well, thank you all for coming. Make sure I can get this thing working. Pasayat Dijuhal with AKDA, Tracie Revis SAT, Sahisapani SAT. So my name is Tracie Revis. I introduced myself in my Yuchi language, which is how I was raised, was more Yuchi. I am 2 tribes. I am also the first generation to not have been forcibly removed and placed in a government-run boarding school. I did grow up traditional, and I'm originally from Oklahoma. But I say all of that because really understanding who we are and how our culture evolved is really the heart of everything. And while I'm talking about the reconnection, the people is really the core of everything. And I do tours at the Ocmulgee Mounds. And just so you know, the word is Ocmulgee, like oak tree. And I say that because here in Georgia, living here in the South, so many of our words are mispronounced. And there isn't really a lot of reference here because we were all forcibly removed. There are 0 federally recognized tribes in the state today. And because of that, a lot of times you hear misinterpretations of our language. But understanding who we are is really the core. And so when I do tours at the park, which is not what my job is, but it is something that people who grew up around Macon, around the mounds, they know that they're there. They walked through, did their own interpretation, and they never really understood the people. And I ask people all the time, if something happened cataclysmic and everything is destroyed and all that remains are your bones, would you understand anything about the people? So if something happened today, would anyone, 100 years, thousands of years from now, understand cell phones and Grubhub and all the things that we do every single day? Because that's a part of our everyday culture. So culture is so key and so much a part of everything that oftentimes gets overlooked because we look at the scientific, which is significant. But we do not call ourselves the Mississippian era people or the woodland people. We call ourselves the Muscogean people, or we go by our Idawas, our tribal town. So that's some of what I'm going to talk about. But more than that, because Matt's going to follow up with a lot of that history, I tell it through a different lens because I grew up traditional. I grew up with all my family that are first language speakers. And so I hear things differently. But I'm here to really talk about the key that you would not hear of what it's really like for the nation to come back in. So we introduce ourselves because that is really core of who we are. And what I say when I introduce myself is, I'm a Yuchi woman in this life and in the next. This is how I will always be known to any of my spirit ancestors that are around. And that is really at the core of who I am. But the second level of identity is I'm Dasla, I'm Wolf Clan. So my clan is who I'm related to on this earth and those things. And then I go through who my family is. And so this is my family. My great-grandmother, my great-grandfather, and then these are some boarding school photos that as we made it into Oklahoma and what the Indian boarding schools did up until the federal government operated over 400 Indian boarding schools across the United States. So removal is one thing, but our removal story did not really end when we made it into Oklahoma. And there's still a lot more trauma and things that happened for us on that side of things. And this is my grandmother on the right at one of the schools. And then that's my father on the left. So my dad is full blood. He's half Creek, half Yuchi. He was taken when he was 6 years old, but did not leave until he was 18. So run by the system. and that's my grandmother on the right, because my grandma got to come back into the homelands, and that is at the Salzburger Foundation, or the Salzburger celebration that they do over around Savannah, because that was all Yuchi territory. So my grandmother is deceased, but she was a full-blood Yuchi, first language speaker, and her sister, my Aunt Addie, actually lived here in the 1970s and worked at the park. And so I'm going to talk about her a bit today too. So the whole story begins, really, to understand where we're at today. So you're going to hear about removal. You're going to hear about the histories. You all come from this industry that's what you do. You study history. You look at those things, right? But actually meeting Native people and talking to Native people is very different. When you hear from us, we don't tell the stories the same way that you will read them in the books. And a lot of times when you read the historical books, and I read all over, and people ask me for, reading list, because a lot of the books that we're reading, this isn't right. And it's people who regurgitate each other's academia works, right? But they've never once talked to an Indigenous person. And so while there's history that is being retold and rewritten and published, most of the times our voice has been left out of every bit of it. And that is what's so significant. So my story really begins from how I ended up in Georgia and why I ended up in Georgia and what is actually happening today. So the moment it all began. So I was the first female chief of staff. I was actually living in California. I was a gaming commissioner for the nation. I did work for the National Council, our legislative body, when I was in law school. So I've always been around Indian country. That's all I've ever done. I grew up all over the country doing a lot of different things. Both my parents were military, but most of my work has been centered in giving a voice back to those without a voice. And I say that as a child who, when I was in high school, I was told Indians don't go to college, don't apply here, right? I don't care what your skin color is, you're not going to succeed. Indians do not succeed. Go to community college, you don't have a voice. And when I applied and I went to OU was graduating more Native students at the time than any other university. We had more than 14 Native organizations that were supporting students. And that is really where I learned, how do we advocate for our own people and put a voice back in without just being angry? How do we become productive? So my entire career has really been working within Indian culture through urban communities, through the legislative branch. I began working on the Hill for Congressman Grijalva, working within my own nation and then other areas. And so my knowledge comes from a lot of vast experience of the things that we're doing here today. But back to here. So I was chief of staff. Chief brought me home in 2021, and we knew each other through ceremonial stuff. That's how I knew him. And he's a traditionalist. He grew up as a first language speaker of Muscogee. And so when he started school, he was always a little behind because it was his second language was to speak English. And so we grew up with that understanding. And so he brought me back, and I was back in Oklahoma, and we had to come to Georgia. And so we all flew in. It was second chief. So next to me is second chief Del Weaver, former chief James Floyd, and then current principal chief David Hill. And we came back to Georgia, and for whatever reason, we all decided we were all on the same flight, but we all had separate cars, and I don't know why. And we all drove down to Macon separately. And as we're passing locations, I'm passing Indian Springs, where the treaty was signed. I'm passing the Galalega River, that is not pronounced like that here. It's pronounced Tawalagi in other ways. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And we make it into Macon. And we're going around and we see the word Ocmulgee. We see all these things because our tribal headquarters in Oklahoma is Ocmulgee, Oklahoma, right? So I'm like, okay, this is familiar. We're in the homelands. And we go to eat at a local establishment with the name Ocmulgee on the title. And there's a beer on tap called the Muscogee Curse. We're like, yikes. And then there's another food called the Holy Peyote. And there's all of these really offensive things, but they don't know that they're offensive. And there's imagery on the wall. And it is, okay, this is interesting. We go to the park, and there's just anger that's just seething. And that anger is really important because that is what we've been taught our whole lives from a cultural perspective, is we are not allowed to come home. We made it into Oklahoma and we cannot come back. Don't look back. And a lot of our songs, even songs that were sang on removal routes that we still sing today, all say, no looking back, always moving forward, don't look back. We can't go home. Well, there's a misinterpretation there. And so we all grew up with that. But I know that my family has actually worked here in Georgia and done a lot here around the landscape. And so it was trying to figure out how this whole thing came together, this piecing together. And as we're out and I'm following Chief, who's doing an interview that day, I'm staffing him. And if you've seen, not to do a shameless plug, but for a shameless plug, my TED Talk, I talk about this. I talk about crossing a bridge that goes to the first mound site. And I smelled the medicine that we still use today in our ceremonies. And that is when everything became real. Very real for me that our ancestors are still here. And it's a spiritual context of it. It is, are we physically still here? No, we only have 400 citizens that live in the state of Georgia. But culturally, our medicines that came from these lands, how we survived, how we are still living today, and how we still have our language, we are still here. And so I went to work. After we left there, I talked to Chief and said, they don't know us. They don't know us in Georgia. They don't know us in our homelands. And we need to find a way to reconnect with this community. And so that is really, this is the day we were on top of the earth, or the top of the temple mound, and we left from there. So fast forward, the park is obviously what I do is the primary that who knows that we're working on becoming a national park? Show of hands. Thank you, amazing. And we were really close and I can follow up with that at the end. But the park is so significant because it was protected and because those mound sites were protected. That is what kept our voice and our presence there in Macon. Had that mound been destroyed, it would have been just another fictional story of what once was. But thank God the mounds were protected. So we were removed. We left after the Treaty of 1821. We were gone. Well, the park gets established in 1936, but we are still not a part of that story. In the 1950s, if you go through a lot of history there, in the 1950s, there is not really a presence, but there is the idea of how do we bring the story of the Indigenous people back. And this is a fair warning. This is something that, and I will talk about this from the archaeological side and from the southeastern. There's a big discussion going on about whether or not to show this, but this is a burial. So if you do not want to look, I'm fair warning you. This is the postcard that was issued out of the park from the 1950s. And in the 1950s, and this is extremely offensive, and I hope you're offended, because what happened in the 1950s at the park is that they took various remains after the excavation, the largest archaeological dig still in the US today, 2.3 million artifacts that came from that site, and recreated this to look like a human, but they're not all the same people. These come from different people. And it was reconstructed to look like the dead Indian there in the mound. And plexiglass was put over it and people could come in and look at the dead Indians. That's not our story and that's not how we tell that story. But that is what is on a postcard that you can still buy today at eBay. We got way out of order. We went to the very end. So in the 1970s, so I'm fast forwarding, I'm going through a lot of history here, but in the 1970s, there was a big push across the United States, civil rights, right? Other people have voices. As Indigenous people, we didn't get the right to vote until 1924. We had our own separate Civil Rights Act in 1968. I am an Indian law attorney, that is my background. So I do talk about a lot of legal stuff, but in 1968, after that happened, in the 70s, the parks were like, how do we bring that tribal voice back? Let's bring the people back. A very key piece of legislation passed in 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act. And what that act really said was tribes from the federal government side, we have a trust responsibility to take care of you, but we are tired of taking care of you. You do your own thing, provide for yourselves. You know, you can now go be sovereign once again, even though it's your inherent right. We're going to let you go and do it. We're giving you blessing to go do it. Well, the park took cue from that and said, how do we bring them back? On the right, this is also a postcard, is my aunt in the red dress. When she worked at the park, they did a recreation and she ran the Indian Trading Post. She lived here for 5 years, going around. And if you've ever heard of anyone talk about Addie George, that is my aunt. That's my grandma's sister. She's actually the one who taught me my greeting and said, always you tell them that you're a Yuchi woman because this is who you are in this life. But that is my connection back into these lands. And so my story continued from somebody who started it a long time ago to back to where we're at today. So this is all our work. So in the 1970s, also what was happening in Macon, in this attempt to how do we bring the people back? In 1972, it was Macon's sesquicentennial, 175 years, and Macon did the Creek Spectacle Week, the Creek Week. And they produced things like The Creeks Have Returned. And this is a book that you guys are welcome to look at. It's from the park. And they put on a play, and the play was the Creek Spectacle, and they had what they called the Bosqueda Society. Bosqueda in our language means, in Muscogean language means like corn, it's like the husk. It references our green corn ceremonials. And there was a society that created that here. And you could be an honorary Indian and get a pen. And I have the pen here. And you could get an award that says you are an honorary brave for the week. And look at all of those things. Well, they also commissioned this coin that says the Trail of Tears is not the Trail of Cheers. And a play was commissioned, and then a parade commenced where they invited the nation to come back to put on a demonstration stickball game. And there was discussion about doing a Creek and Cherokee game, one against the other. But that would have not been a good thing because Creeks and Cherokees don't really get along. We never really have. We still have tensions today. We ally with a lot of things, but we are separate tribes and we are not the same. And because of that, ball ground is the dividing line between us. And that is literally ball ground because it is a stickball ground. And they were given that land because they agreed to fight against the Red Sticks. But because of all of that, they said, no, let's not do that battle. Let's get some other stickball players to come in and do a demonstration. And so we were paraded through the streets of Macon, and there's photos in here. And everywhere you went, people put in their businesses, honor the Creek Indians. And there's, if you look at the TV guide, horrific imagery of women with their breasts out and scantily clad. And this is how Indians look. And so while it was meant, I think, with good intention, it didn't land, I think, the way that they intended it to land. And I say that because I know people who were here on that trip in 1970s, and they talked about how negative that experience was coming back into the homelands and being here and being a part of this. Well, we fast forward to today. So in 2022, after going back from 2021, when we were here, I went back to talk to Chief and said, we got to do more. He said, okay. And I was here, I got sent here to Georgia 4 more times that year alone. And during that time, it became very apparent that we needed somebody here. And I got asked the question, what do you need? I said, we need boots on the ground. The only way to truly make a difference here, to unveil the truth and to correct the history, is for us to have somebody here and to truly be partners. And Chief said, okay, let's do it. So in 2022, I moved here. And so I went to work with OPPI, the National Park Initiative, to make sure we put the tribal voice back into these lands. And because Macon was a capital city for us, it makes sense to start everything that we were going to do in the homelands back there in Ocmulgee, back here in Macon. So this is just some photos. You're going to see a lot of photos here. That year, we invited Secretary Holland to come. We had a big dinner where the nation sent 150 people here to come and be a part of that. We broke bread together and with Maconites and said, let's start this journey together. How we do things is important. Our voice is important. And Chief Hill always says, if you are not at the table, then you're on the menu. And we have been on the menu for so long. And today we are choosing to take our place. And so that is where we have really stepped into this. We don't need people to do things for us. We can do things for ourselves. So these are just a quick photos and I'll kind of get you through some of it. Part of this, you can't see it on my screen. So part of this has been, we passed legislation in Macon. And when we passed legislation in December of 22, the county commissioner that authored it is my counterpart in the initiative, Seth Clark, who is Mayor Pro Tem for Bibb County. He authored it and we wrote it and the entire county commission passed it. And what it did was it raised our flag over City Hall. And that flag is not allowed to come down, but by a vote of county commission. And that is important. Things are way backward. And so when we raised that, we had a whole ceremony. We had a gift exchange with the mayor, and our flag proudly flies over City Hall today, and you'll see it at all times. But with that, the other thing that came with that legislation was a commitment to reconciliation, to truth. Well, it can't be one way. A lot of times what happens is people expect us to come here, which we will always come here because these are our homes. These are our homelands. Our people are buried here, but they don't go to Oklahoma to understand who we are. So when I say that, relationship is a two-way street, it is. We've now taken over 200 people from Macon to Oklahoma to understand what happened at the end of the river. This tree that we're standing in front of, this is called the council oak tree. It's in Tulsa. Tulsa comes from the word Tallahassee or Tallahassee. And then because Idalwa is one of our words, and Idalwa refers to all the towns, which is why everything in the South is referenced by the name of Tala, because Tala comes from Idalwa, which became Dalwa and became Tala as it got anglicized. But as we made it into Oklahoma, in Tulsa, which comes from Tallahassee, they buried the ashes of one of the fires there underneath this tree. And this is our home now forever. And so that tree is over 400 years old. It was standing then, it's been standing since. We actually recently just got that tree back. The city of Tulsa gave it back to the nation. And so every year we have a council oath ceremony, and all the tribal towns of the fires that made it into Oklahoma, of the 45 fires that made it, of the 16 that still remain today, we still have this ceremony every year. So we take people there, and on the bottom is our ambassador to the nation, Jonathan Chowdhury, who is a former judge for the nation under our Supreme Court. He's also a former National Indian Gaming Commission chair, and today he's the ambassador for the nation living in DC. But we've had people go both ways to understand when you get to the reservation what that means, because we carried our stories with us and our history is still living. It's still happening today. And so oftentimes when people get there, they don't understand what does it mean to be a reservation when you've got a city in the middle of it. Because it's not like what you see on TV. We're not like the Navajo Nation. We're not like Standing Rock or any of the other reservations, because our history developed differently. And so making it into Oklahoma and understanding that story is a two-way street for us. So we started that with that legislation. On the bottom is Macon Magazine article that was published, because we are not a part of the everyday look of Macon. We don't have our citizens here. And so we have worked with Macon Magazine to start incorporating Native voices in there. So we have a Native author that writes for Macon Magazine. And so there's always going to be a representation of us in the magazine. We also recently, the street signs are now in English and in Muscogee in downtown. A private donor donated the funding for this. And so all of downtown has it in English and in Muscogee. So it's hard to see in the photo, but it's underneath it. So all the street signs in downtown Macon are in English and Muscogee. Why? Because we get the opportunity to talk about the roads, to talk about that a lot of the roads in Georgia come off of our old trading roads. And that, millions of people have walked these streets, but not knowing the history of it is important. And you lose the context that you're not the original stewards of this land. You're the current stewards, but you're not the original stewards. And so understanding whose steps you walk in, and there have been many, many steps and many stories. And then most recently, the other things that we've done, we have an all Indigenous film festival now in Macon that is held in conjunction with the Macon Film Festival. It's called Fire Starters. We have an alleyway in downtown Macon. It's called Bright City. It's a privately funded thing that I have been a part of for the last 4 years. And the funder has said, do what you need to do. And so I've kind of captured the alleyway to put Native photography, Native artists on display. And so the photos on the left, those were the photos that are currently hanging in the alleyway. Not the light boxes light up at night, so that when you walk through, you actually see our faces of modern people in our traditional clothes today. And this exhibit is called Armor and Adornment, and it talks about the clothing, the evolution of clothing from buckskin to trade cloth, why cotton being a big part of the South, the trade mills, and how that evolved, blankets and how that style evolved, how we went into ribbons, the evolution in what we do today. That's all what's in this exhibit hanging currently. This is kind of a You can just kind of see some of the photos. So there's a modern and a historical. I sent this to one of the models who couldn't make it back to the opening. And then last night, we actually cut the ribbon on the Bicentennial Park. Macon just celebrated its 200 years. Unfortunately, I was able to be a part of the committee. I'd only been at Macon for less than a year, and I got thrown on the committee. And because you cannot tell the story of Macon without telling the Indigenous story. And so in this park, we actually brought in we opened up the call for other artists, but I have a native designer, Creek artist on the left. His name's Kenneth Johnson. Who created a sculpture that this is a 14-foot Georgia marble carved stone that talks about Ocmulgee and the mother town that it was, and how the mother town gave her fire to her daughters up and down the river. And that's what this represents. There's a lot of meaning in this whole piece. You know, we were just recently in the Macon Fashion Week where we had native designers who came and walked, and you got to see us in the everyday. And this is a contemporary fashion. And that last jacket is really amazing. It actually has the Trail of Tears on it. And in the inside, when you open it up, there's a QR code and you listen to some of the hymns that were sang on Removal Route. You get to hear it on that jacket. So what is the difference? Why do I talk about all this stuff? The difference between 1972 to today and why things are different today, what you're seeing in Macon, is because, again, we got to be at the table. I talk a lot about gaming, and I talk about gaming and why you didn't hear from us until now, because before that in 1975, tribes didn't have the funding to even provide for our own people. We couldn't do our own housing. We couldn't provide our own jobs. We couldn't do any of those things. But after 1975, after that legislation passed, the government said, okay, tribes, you're on your own. Go make money. Our land is held in trust by the federal government. We cannot collateralize our land. So how do you start a business? How do you do anything economic value that you can provide for your people? We can't go into the bank and ask because we're a tribe, so we have a separate status. And so bingo is actually where all of this began in California. And tribes out there started doing bingo, and bingo was low overhead. It was an easy pop-up that you could get started. And bingo then became digitized into electronic bingo, which eventually evolved into gaming. And gaming has been the thing that has allowed us to have the funding to be able to start taking back our own narrative. And so I talk about gaming because gaming is an issue that's coming up in the state of Georgia right now. It's been in discussion. But these are historical conversations that will eventually become a part of a record way down the road. From the tribal side of things, you know, we are more regulated than any other entity. More than Vegas, in fact, way more than what Georgia is doing. I will tell you that. As a former gaming commissioner, I did compliance. It's interesting to me to see what's happening in Georgia. But that investment for the nation, we now have 13 casinos. You know, we have resorts. We have other things that we've done. We have a tribal college. We are the fourth largest tribe in the United States with over 100,000 citizens. We will never call ourselves members. Because we are a sovereign nation. We have an inherent right to govern our own people, our law, our land. And I say that because just like you're not a member of the United States, you're not a club, you're a citizen, right? We are citizens of a nation. And all of this is established in all the previous treaties, the original treaty of 1733 that gave up the islands, to every treaty going forward. We were notified as a nation. We are a nation of people. And there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States today. Over 200 native languages still spoken today. And while we only make up 2% of the population, in the U.S., we are still growing and we're still strong. We're still here through forced removal, through boarding schools, through the 1970s forced sterilization, all the things that were happening. We're still here today. So because of that survival, allowing us to be able to tell our own story and being a partner with us is really what we've been seeking. And that has been the difference that we're now seeing in Macon. And that really comes down to respect. Respect. Respect has been what we have realized in Macon, when we are willing to say, you tell us what you've heard, we'll tell you our side of it, and let's find in the middle where things went awry. And I know that since I've been in Georgia, I get a story from every person about how somebody's great was Native, and everyone. There's a joke in Indian country. Indian country is a legal term of art. It's all indigenous lands across the U.S. That every man and his dog is Cherokee. That's the joke, because Cherokee Nation is a legitimate tribe. They do have legitimate culture and heritage. However, every person has seen the word Cherokee, and so everyone globs onto this identity. And in the South, what we realized, a lot of it is as lands were being auctioned off and lost from that were treaty lands as they were being auctioned off, a lot of people were actually allies. Most people don't realize, again, removal was not one path. It happened over a series of years. The longest route being 10 months that we've recorded, the shortest being 4 months. You know, women and children went a lot of times down south through the Gulf and came up through the Mississippi and over, being held into Arkansas in a concentration camp for over a year before making it into Oklahoma. You know, men were taken up north a whole different way. But all of that is so significant that what people don't realize is that we lived amongst our settler neighbors for hundreds of years before removal happened. And you all, I'm speaking to the choir here, you all know this, but so much of the public doesn't know that. And so much of the public thinks that, you know, the settlers came and we just left. And people have asked Chief Hill, well, why did you guys leave? He's like, we didn't leave. We were forced. We were removed. Like, we didn't want to leave our homelands, but we were forced to leave our homelands. And you all know all the other political things that went into that forced removal. But our stories and our culture that went with it, that survived, tells a lot more of how things were here before all of that contact happened. And so I talk about a lot of those things where people, they go, really? But with that, because of those friendships and the long years of us living amongst those settler neighbors, there were allies. We had more allies than we had people who wanted us removed. And because of that, as lands were allotted, a lot of people would say, well, they were like family. They were family, the next generation, they were family. And then the stories become that, oh, well, we're Native, right? And from an indigenous person, and what we deal with a lot in Indian country is all of a sudden today, everybody wants to be Indian, right? Everybody wants to be Indian. And it's a situation we deal with here in Georgia. It's a situation we deal with in the South. But we are doing everything we can to come back in and be partners. So we are using Macon, what's happening in Macon, as our model to go across the Southeast of how we become partners with people, how, you know, working with the governments, working with universities, working with other entities, how do we grow the story and correct and then meet people where they are, right? We can't erase what somebody has learned their whole life, but we can start from this point forward and say, let's actually have a real conversation and grow that relationship and grow from there. So Macon has been our model. With that, we are also working with Columbus. Columbus has actually passed legislation as well, as they are raising a flag over one of their report houses that are coming. We're working on doing satellite offices here in the Southeast because of all the 106 claims that come. So with that, we're also looking at with the park, and when the park bill passes, our land that the nation owns in Macon will actually go into trust. We will officially have reservation back in the state of Georgia again, and that's huge, right? It'll be our law, our land again. And then with that, we can partner with other entities to do other things. We can bring on our FEMA declarations and other things that we have abilities to do as sovereign entities that others do not have the ability to do. So we've worked recently with Make and Bid Emergency Management. The nation has the largest and the voted as the best tribal disaster mitigation plan in the country. And with that, there's a lot of things. So because of all the toys and things that the nation has with how large our boundaries are, we said, Bibb County, you need anything, we'll deploy. We'll be there. Same with Columbus. We've already worked with Mayor Dickens here. We raised the flag over Standing Peachtree Park. We've given talks up there. we are working with Okefenokee in the big push for the World Heritage Site out there, because that was our land out there as well. Does anybody, random question, does anybody know what the word Tybee, who's Tybee Island, what that name means? Because this is a group that would probably know, so I'm curious. No, Tybee is actually comes from a Yuchi word, and it's Dalby, which means salt, and it refers to the salt marshes. And I was over at Tybee, and I asked at their visitor center, do you know what the name is? And they're like, oh, it's a Cherokee word or some other tribe, we don't know. And they made up a meaning. They're like, we just make it up. I'm like, wow, okay, this is important. And I say that because what we were doing in Macon is we were working with Visit Macon, our CVB there, to make sure that everything that they are doing, because cultural tourism is important, correcting the history and the story and documenting it, but also how do we promote it? And so we were working with our CVB, and with that, the nation, it can't just be me. I can't be the sole person here. So the nation sits on the board for Visit Macon as well. So we have seats on that. We have seats on the Ocmulgee Mountains Association board, that there's direct relationship there. I sit on the Chamber's board. The nation is a part of the Macon Chamber as well. So we are investing in that community as well to bring our dollars, not just do something for us, let us invest. We're working on a cultural center that is being given, the land is being given, it's a historic house, and once it gets rehabbed, it will be deeded to the nation, and then we will turn that into a cultural center and run it ourselves. And so all of those things are what we are doing to help be back in our homelands, to correct the history and to move forward into a new day. But it's about partnership. It really is about partnership, and it's about respect, and it's us meeting people where they are. And so with that, I will answer any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Started relationships with the city of Atlanta.
Yes, so we have Chief Hill and the mayor have met. The commissions have met with the National Council as well. They've done a few things there. We have Muscogee Park here in Atlanta. We do have Muscogee Park already that was redesignated, and so our symbols and things are on the painted in, and there's some other opportunities that we're looking at doing. I think it would be great if the mayor re-recorded his welcome to Atlanta in the Hartsville International Airport and said the ancestral homeland of the Muscogee and the Cherokee. Like, I think that would be great, right? That's a story, right? That is giving proper respect. So we are working on new opportunities, but me being here has really been, while I do not officially work for the nation any longer, so I cannot speak for Chief unless I've been given authority, I bring everything back to the nation. So we bring the nation in and out all the time. They're in and out. We do a lot of work with Emory. We have a program directly with Emory, and that we send students from Emory to Oklahoma. We do some language learning. And then we have students that come here, and we bring people here to do things. Any questions?
Your identity as a nation. My understanding is the Creek Muscogee was an amalgamation of various other groups.
Tribal towns.
Now the identity is as one group.
So the tribal towns, I have a whole different presentation for this. Because of the time, I was like, I can't get into all of that. So from the tribal towns, if you understand, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and now what is known as Creek are all come from the same language, right? Natchez as well. All of us come from the same language stock of the Muscogee language. So
there's some creeks that weren't Muscogee.
So I'm getting there. So the language, as the language started to break down and people started to divide, stories started going one way, splitting off into other areas. The way we identify, though, is not, we didn't call ourselves Muscogee, and actually the Cherokees called us that. That is not what we called ourselves. Just like the Cherokees are not what they called themselves, we called them that. I'm Yuchi, and that is not what we call ourselves. We call ourselves Oyaha, the Muskogees called us that. So all of us lived in our towns, right? So I'm Yuchi, who lived in the Southeast as well. And my tribal town on my grandpa's side, on my Muscogean side, is Casita. So from that Casita side and my Yuchi side, and I'm from Polecat on on that side. So that would have been my town. Your town is how you would have been identified, right? So the town is what's so important. But as, again, settlers coming into the region looking at us, different settlers would identify us differently, which is why all throughout the Southeast, there's all these other tribes that I'm like, that's not a tribe. They were just a different tribal town of the same people. It's the same with the Yamasee, which are Muscogean speaking. They have a different dialect, just like the Hitchiti have a different dialect, but it comes from the same language that evolved over time. Seminoles were just on the wrong side of the border when the Spanish were colonizing Florida, and they were named from them. So all of us living in these different towns, well, then all of this really came, that the Confederacy came from the influence of treaties. That is actually where that came from. So all the different towns living all throughout the Southeast, there were still mothers. There's still a society. So you still had your mother in your capital city, and your different towns would report to that one mother. There were main fires throughout the South. And so it would be like, almost like you would think of a different state. So like in Macon or Wolga was a capital city, and there were towns that all reported to that one. Well, over in the Alabama side, Abica is a mother ground. Coweta is a mother ground. And so different towns that report to it. Well, as treaties are signed, each tribal town had to have their signature on that treaty because they are autonomous, just like a city, right? Like a mayor for a city. And so each tribal town had to sign off on that. They didn't want that. So our first treaty obviously was with the British Crown. And eventually as they became a part of the United States and we started having to sign treaties with the US, they wanted one signature. And so they required us to, that is where the Confederacy came in, right? So the Confederacy came in, they just threw a big blanket around, all of these people will now be a part of this Confederacy. Yuchi's got mixed in underneath that. Natchez got mixed in under that. And it became who allied, right? Well, it's the same with Alabama, but they became the uppers, we became the lowers. We come from the same people, but we were evolving differently. Because over here, we had the English settlers were coming in way faster than what they hit Alabama. But we're the same people. So when the Creek Wars hit and we're fighting against each other because the lower had to fight against the upper, and as well as the Cherokees, as that's happening, we were still all the same people, but we're having to fight against each other because of the way the Confederacies split up and how all that happened. So when removal actually happens, well, backing up one sec. So as each treaty is signed, and you're going down treaty maps and you're going and moving, people are moving. We're not rebuilding mounds. People are blending together. The settlers and the missionaries had already come in, and a lot of the towns, the tribal towns, the fires had started to go out and they were no longer ceremonial. So the churches come in, and the biggest influences were between the Baptist and the Methodist, or the biggest influences. And so those towns go out. And so if you don't have a town, then you don't really exist. So from the nation side, when we talk about Tomachichi, he was a renegade. He was kicked out of his tribal town. He didn't have a town. If you don't have a town, you don't really exist. You're not really a part of it anymore. But he was kicked out. But if you don't have a town, you don't really exist anymore as a people. That is really your identity, is your tribal town, your Itawa. So if you look at how those confederacies were blended, and we're being forced to move, and towns are going away, and some people are starting to blend because they're marrying in, or they're allowed to join another tribal town. We all, again, move over between the Chattahoochee Valley, right? So lowers all go to the southern, the uppers all, after the Creek Wars, get moved to the upper. And so we're all along that valleyway, along the Chattahoochee River. We are still already being identified in every treaty as a nation because it was a treaty, which is what you do with foreign lands, we are considered a nation. And then as the Supreme Court is established, they start doing decisions. The first Supreme Court decision of the United States is actually an Indian law case, right? And they're looking at that. They're trying to figure out, are they nations? Are they people? Are they domestic dependents? Who are they? How do we identify with them? And they are sovereign, and they are a foreign territory. And so we start getting identified as that. So all the towns get wrapped up underneath it because the United States is looking at us like we're all the same. So we all came in, even though we kept our separate tribal town identities. We kept all of that separate within our own. But from their perspective, they wanted one signature to be able to sign on. Well, then they got to the point where they determined who our chief would be, who was going to be the signatory. So the United States decided all of that. So then as we get removed, we all get forced into Oklahoma. Well, lower and uppers didn't get along. Right? They were fighting against each other, but we all got forced to become the nation. So we were all forced into the same lands into Oklahoma, even though we were very different. Interestingly enough, as we made it into Oklahoma, we set up just like we did in the South. So the tribal towns, the way they lived along the rivers, are exact order in Oklahoma. And so the uppers are all in the northern half of the lowers are in the northern half of Oklahoma and the uppers are in the southern half of the reservation boundaries. So we split, but we all had to become one. And that all became underneath our government, the way our council house and all that happened. But to answer your question, we are various tribal towns that come from the same language, same culture, same ceremonies, but we all got forced in underneath. And so all of that is what makes up the nation. But the nation does come from historical records, the title, long way around. Other questions?
Oh, I was just going to ask a follow-up. How does that interface now with the United States?
We are considered only as one, except that in the 1930s, the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, that piece of legislation, said any tribe, because backing up, there were 3 original tribes that roamed through the Oklahoma territory. Over 69 tribes get forced into this little piece of land, right? And then that got cut up even more. Tribes that were not even related were forced to become one. Otoe, Missouri became one tribe. So as all of that came in, all the tribal towns, we still keep our identities by our fires, by our ceremonial grounds. We still keep those separate identities. So you have a ceremonial chief and you have a government chief. That's the difference. And so in the 1930s, when that passed, there were several tribes that didn't feel like they were getting the recognition. And any tribe that wanted to apply to become their own separate band or tribe could. And 3 of the tribal towns actually applied and got recognized. So they have the recognition. So you got Alabama, Quasati, Alabama Quasati, Kaleji, and Slapaco are the 3 tribal towns that exist. And then Seminole Nation is right next to us, but Seminoles are our neighbors, our relatives as well, but they just were on the other side. So those 3 tribal towns are recognized. However, they are within the boundaries of the nation. So they're considered a tribal town, so a separate tribe, their own federal status, but they still have to rely on the nation for services. So our courts and stuff like that, if that makes sense. So it's like their own corporation, so they get to do their own business. But they're also Muscogee, if that makes sense. It's complex.
So the Yuchi, they're not all within like the Muscogee,
We are officially a part of Muscogee Creek Nation.
not any in the Cherokee.
Are there people who have mixed blood? Yes. But no, the Yuchis are officially a part of underneath the Creek Nation.
So did they move mainly in removal? They went.
We went with them. Yeah, we all were moved. So Yuchi Town, which is around Fort Benning, was the last largest big settlement. There was 3 other settlements in the area. We had 10 fighters make it into Oklahoma. Yuchi Town did. But that whole area, if you read through like Swanton, several other different people, they talk about how we lived apart from them. We could speak Muscogee, they couldn't speak Yuchi. We look different than the Muscogees. They are broader bone, darker skin, dark eyes. We are lighter skin, gray eyed, and we are known to be like the most beautiful. And so oftentimes, and I'm partial to that. But I oftentimes would hear that they would go and they would kidnap our women. But the Yuchis have applied for federal recognition. So the nation has always acknowledged that we are a separate tribe. We have our separate grounds, our separate language. We are a language isolate. All of our elder first language speakers have passed. We have a second generation of first language speakers. Today, we probably have about 30 fluent speakers today. My grandma, they were all a part of that as first language speakers that passed. But yet we have a lot of babies that are learning and they're speaking Yuchi. And now we're starting to see more Yuchis marrying other Yuchis, but we are mixed in within the Creek Nation. But in the 1950s, we worked on federal recognition to break away from the nation to be separate, because they acknowledge we're separate. They know we're separate, but we are still within their boundaries. And so that didn't move anywhere. And we applied for the OFA process in the 90s. It got denied. I was the executive director for Yuchi working on federal recognition with the OFA changes, Office of Federal Acknowledgement changes. And I walked away from it because in order to do that, what's difficult, the way the political landscape works and the legal landscape works, you have to be willing, you cannot hold 2 tribe enrollments. You can only be enrolled in 1 tribe. So if you went to Haskell Indian Nations and met, which is what the joke is, there's Haskell Rascals, which is a tribal college in Kansas. And so you've got every tribe coming in. So you have somebody who's Paiute, Shoshone with a Seminole, and there's like these weird mixtures of blood. I have one of the guys who was just in the show that we just opened. His mom's my best friend, and she's Yuchi and Creek. We met in college. And her husband is is Choctaw, Seminole, and Chickasaw. And so the boys are 5 tribes, everything but Cherokee. So, and I have friends that are 10 tribes. I mean, it's just one of those things.
So were there Yuchi in East Tennessee?
Mm-hmm. Tennessee actually comes from a Yuchi word. It is not a Cherokee word.
So I was trying to, where did they end? When
So-
they removed, did they remove with Cherokee because of
No,
where they were?
No, we had already moved south. We had already moved south and we were down into this confederacy, we had moved away from them. So Yuchi's moved around a lot. We have an interesting story. There's a lot more to our story. If you were to talk to my grandma and all of them, our stories come up that we came up through the Bahamas. Our stories talk about pushing the dinosaurs back into the ocean, the land creatures back in. That's what goes into our songs of where we were and how we evolved, which is different than the Muscogees. And while we have some of the same ceremonies, they're called the same ceremonies, they mean very different things. So our ribbon dance is very different. So Yuchi's, our order is different. What it means is very different. Why we wear the colors. Our ribbons represent, and our ribbon dance represent the creation story, the blessing of the earth, and there's more that goes into it when we say Kohanthane. Whereas on the Muscogee side, the women dance first, and the women clear the way from the previous year to make way for the new year. Our way, the men prepare after they've scraped the ground, and the women are the only ones who can bring life. So we bring in the women with our ribbons, our combs, to touch the ground, to bless the ground after the men have prepared it. There's different meanings in both sides of them, but if you didn't know the difference, you would look at us and think we're the same, but we are very different.
You said there's only 400 Muscogee citizens living in Georgia. Are there other people doing like cultural heritage and government jobs like you've done? Or is it like, cause like you described it as almost like an isolating position that you've been in?
My joke is that I'm the lone wolf. I'm wolf clan. So, from the nation as a whole, like sending someone, no. Do we have individual citizens who live here? Yes. That do other jobs and other things? Yes. But because I represented the administration in a lot of the work that I do, so Chief Hill, our current form of government, which he's the 7th chief under our current form of government, our constitution was passed in 1979. We were a 3-branch system. Look very similar to the United States, but he is the principal chief, which he is elected. Our ceremonial chiefs are very different. So Chief Hill, he doesn't go by the name of Miko, which is what we call our ceremonial chiefs. When you go to a ceremonial ground, that chief is in charge over those ceremonial grounds, that fire he determines. If Chief Hill shows up while he represents the nation and while it's our culture, his role is he's just there as a visitor, or he's just if it's his ground, he's a member of that ground. But his role as principal chief does not apply there because he is the elected chief. He's not the ceremonial chief. And so there is a difference between those two. There's a lot of, if you've seen anything, we have a big fight right now with Auburn University. If you've seen any of this, to get our remains back, it's called Justice for Hickory Ground. You can look it up on the website, Justice for Hickory Ground. Hickory Ground, or Ojibwa, as it is called in the traditional name, where the porch ended up with that land over there, where they set up, there was an agreement that they were not to, they were always to protect our cultural sites, because that was the last ceremonial site for Ojibwa. And after the 10-year moratorium, they built their casinos and our remains went into buckets and all of that. Well, all of those remains got sent out to other universities. We pressured Alabama, University of Alabama, we got remains back from there, over 10,000 remains. Auburn has not returned the ancestors, and so there's a big fight. Even though they can show direct descendancy to the remains that they have, they refuse to return the remains. And so there's a big fight over there with all of those things happening. So you will see, again, this is why we are working on putting a satellite office here, having more people down here. But I was kind of sent as a test case to see how we make inroads. What does it look like? What do we need to do? I don't want to just give somebody a flag and go, oh, be our friend, and then they throw it in a closet when we walk away. We are doing it by law, by policy removal, making sure that when we are working, we have a TCP in the Bibb County area, traditional cultural property boundary and NPS designation. And because of that, you're supposed to consult with the tribe anytime you move dirt, if there's anything, because it's not just 106. If you do a 106, it's if there's a federal nexus, if there's federal funding coming in. If it is not federal funding and it's private, then there's no requirement. So the TCP says, hey, there's a bigger boundary here that you need to make sure that you're aware that there could be cultural artifacts and you need to contact the tribe of record. We are working with the park initiative. What we're really working on, reached a strategic plan that's about to come out in January, is revising policies so that people are aware that when you go to turn dirt, what you need to do, right? The Council on Indian Concerns does not have a federally recognized citizen from the nation on their committee here. I mean, the nation is not represented. The Georgia tribes are, but those are state recognized, and they've all been denied federal recognition. So it is the nation's belief that the nation of record, the federal tribe, should be the tribe that is consulted, but we are not on that. So if we can't influence that right away, we are working through policies through local communities, trying to educate them what that means. In Alabama, we have a really good case study that we worked with a private developer that was coming in wanted to build a hotel. And it was the site of Avika, which is a mother ground. And he said, hey, I know I'm not required to talk to y'all, but I'm doing it out of goodwill. I need to build this hotel. It's your cultural land. How do we work together? And the nation said, just bring in the builder. Let's raise the level. We raised it over 6 feet and he was able to build his hotel. The nation visits it when we go through Oxford, Alabama, and we support it. So there are ways for us to work together through some of these difficult barriers because of the land issues, because of development, other things. It's understanding what's in the ground. Just like you don't want somebody digging up your family's remains and, reconnecting them or putting them on display or doing things like that. And that's been the big fight, is from the archaeological community, is what do we show? What are we allowed to show? Are we allowed to show funerary objects? Are we allowed to do drawings of funerary objects? What's permissible? Tribes have all said stop, consult with us. And there's still a big fight that's going on in that community. But I think having more of the nation here and letting us be more of these conversations is really how we're going to move the needle for progress. Other questions? I know my time is up, but
Two quick ones, I think. One is, what would be the best way to follow what's the progress, and the other, anything going on in the Athens area, Athens, Georgia?
So we work with UGA already. We have several relationships up there that we work with their archaeological department. I've worked with their Native American Studies department, done presentations with them. And so there have been a few things. We haven't made as big of an impact there as we have done in other places, but the door is open. So we are working to figure out how we can move that. But again, I do a lot. Anywhere that chief calls and says, I need you to go check this. So between Florida, parts of Tennessee, parts of South Carolina, Alabama, I kind of go wherever, as well as we're working on the national park bill. So just to give you a quick update on that. Obviously it's not passed yet. Congress finally got back to work and our park is finally back open. But in the 118th Congress, we introduced the bill, bipartisan, bicameral support. We had the entire Georgia delegation in support of our bill. which is crazy. So when you have everyone from Marjorie Taylor Greene to Raphael Warnock signing on the same piece of legislation, you got fire at a bottle, you make good with that. So we went through testimony last year in the House. It did not make it out of committee. In the Senate, we passed it out of committee. We were headed to markup there. And then talking with the former director of the National Park Service, Chuck Sands, he told me personally that I thought y'all had it, like you were about to be the next national park. But the hurricane that came through really kind of threw Congress a whole wrench, and they couldn't get an agreement with how to do that. And so that kind of pushed us off. So in the 119th, we reintroduced the bill in March. We still have the same support. Hearings were supposed to already have been scheduled, but because the congressional shutdown, but there's a chance, we still have a chance to get it through this year. There's an opportunity that we could just pass out of committee because we've already gone through committee process. We still have the same support. We have additional support. So there's a chance that it can still get through, but it does take an act of Congress. The park will immediately redesignate the park from the historical park to become the national park. And then it's creating a brand new preserve. The brand new preserve, we draw an artificial boundary around land. However, we have to start acquiring that land. So we will then work with willing land sellers to acquire that land, to put that land back together, to then donate it over to the park to become a preserve. Then the nation has a bigger role. We have to draft a new management plan, and the nation will be a big part of that. Not just cultural interpretation, but land management, species management, all of the things. So that is where the nation comes in as a bigger step in that, which is why we're looking at the satellite offices. And so just fingers crossed, we got to get it over the line, but that's kind of where that one is. And we are doing more in Indian country for our bill than any other national park. Of the 434 parks that are managed by the National Park Service, only 4 of them are co-managed by tribes, but every single one of them are on tribal land. Ocmulgeepark.org. You can go to our website. That's our website. All of our social media is on there. You can follow all of our social media. But it's all on there. Ocmulgeepark.org. And my email's on there too if you need me for anything. Yes, sir.
Is there any plans to remove those train tracks?
Unfortunately, moving a train is not an easy thing. What we're working on, there's been discussion about creating an additional entrance into the park directly off of 16. What we were proposing is that maybe we can build a bridge over those tracks, but those tracks are not going to go away. And it's a difficult situation that we have. We can't get buses in underneath the transom. And so how do we work around? And so, it's just baby steps. We got to get the bill first. Our visitation numbers go from roughly 200,000 annually to about 1.3 million visitors. That is the difference of what becoming a national park means. So, yeah. Thank you all.